Practical Anarchy, A Guide to Self-Determination, Dickie Dredd. And this is the second part of the mini-series that we're doing to address common questions that come up. And last night I posted something about Donald Trump and what his latest actions in Venezuela. And there was a comment which was posted to say that some regime change is justified, and an example for that was the Second World War, done by a refutation by a good friend of mine. I'm going to attempt to show that regime change is never justified, certainly from an anarchistic point of view, and then later today, and I haven't finished this particular essay yet, the second essay yet. I'm still writing it, but I hope to post something which says how we might have gone about the Second World War in a different way that didn't involve so much violence and atrocities, etc. So, again, a more anarchistic approach. And of course, these are just my opinions, but in the written essay, I'll also give some references which I looked at to make those to back up my ideas. So let's go forward. So why regime change is never justified? Regime change is routinely presented as a tragic necessity, a reluctant intervention undertaken to remove tyranny, protect civilians or defend democracy. In practice, it achieves none of these ends. It is a doctrine rooted in imperial authority, strategic arrogance and historical amnesia. Whether justified in the language of humanitarianism, security or moral emergency, regimes change consistently produces outcomes that are more violent, less stable and less accountable than the systems it claims to replace. Recent rhetoric and manoeuvres by Donald Trump, particularly in relation to Latin America and the Middle East, are only the latest iterations of a long-standing assumption in the US and Western foreign policy that powerful states possess both the right and the competence to decide who governs elsewhere. This assumption is not merely mistaken, in my opinion of course, it is structurally authoritarian. So the doctrine of external authority. At its core, regime change rests on a dangerous premise that sovereignty is conditional, and that external powers may revoke it when a government is judged illegitimate. Its judgment is never neutral. It is shaped by strategic interests, access to resources, geopolitical alignment, a domestic political theatre. Populations subjected to regime change are rarely consulted in any meaningful way. Elections are dismissed as fraudulent if they produce inconvenient outcomes and celebrated as democratic triumphs when they align with the external preferences. In this sense, regime change does not defend democracy. It nullifies it, replacing local agency with foreign veto powers. Iraq, the archetypal failure. The Iraq Wars remain the clearest modern demonstration of the catastrophic logic of regime change. The 2003 invasion was justified for a shifting set of claims: weapons of mass destruction, links to terrorism, humanitarian concern, none of which survived contact with evidence. What followed was not liberation but state collapse. The removal of Saddam Hussein dismantled existing institutions without providing functional replacements, creating a vacuum filled with sectarian violence, militia rule, regional proxy wars, and eventually the emergence of ISIS. Hundreds of thousands were killed, millions were displaced. The destabilisation of the region continued decades later. This was not an unfortunate implementation error. It was the predictable outcome of imposing political transformation through military force. Regime change does not remove violence. It redistributes it downward, embedding it in everyday life. Why the Second World War still fails as an exception. The most persistent defence of regime change evokes the Second World War. Nazi Germany is presented as the definitive counterexample, a uniquely evil regime whose removal by external forces proves that intervention can be morally justified and historically necessary. This claim relies on assumptions that do not withstand scrutiny. I'll go through each of those. Hitler had to be removed. At no point did the Allied powers enter the war under a doctrine of regime change. Britain and France declared war following territorial aggression and treaty violations, not because Germany was fascist. The United States entered after Pearl Harbor. The stated objectives were containment, defence and survival, not the moral reconstruction of German society. To retroactively frame the war as a justified regime change operation is to rewrite history in order to legitimise a modern doctrine that did not exist at that time. It also assumes moral clarity that was absent in practice. The Nazi regime was appeased, diplomatically engaged and economically entangled with Western powers for years before war became unavoidable. The outcome proves it was right. This argument commits a results-based fallacy. The fact that Nazi Germany was defeated does not retroactively justify the means employed, nor does it provide a transferable template for future interventions. The Allied victory required actions that would now be classified as war crimes, or crimes against humanity. The firebombing of Dresden and Hamburg, the atomic destruction of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, mass civilian displacement and ethnic cleansing across Eastern Europe. If regime change is defended on moral grounds, then the methods used to achieve it fatally undermine the claim. To argue that the outcome sanctifies the violence is to accept that morality is decided by victory, a principle indistinguishable from authoritarian logic. Nazism was uniquely evil. Nazism was extreme in its industrialization of violence and racial ideology, but treating it as a singular moral anomaly is dangerous. It encourages the belief that future evils will announce themselves with similar clarity, and that exceptional violence will again be obviously justified. At the time, colonial atrocities, racial segregation, eugenics and mass internment were widely accepted practices among the Allied powers themselves. The moral universe of the 1940s was not divided between enlightened democracies and barbaric dictatorships. It was a continuum of domination expressed through different political forms. Evoking Nazism as uniquely evil allows contemporary states to label adversaries as the new Hitler, while ignoring their own structural violence. This rhetorical move has accompanied nearly every major intervention since 1945, from Vietnam to Iraq, and has been wrong every time. Germany benefited in the long run. Post-war reconstruction is often cited as proof that regime change can succeed if followed by institution building and economic support. Its interpretation ignores the conditions that make Germany a non-replicable case. Germany possessed an existing industrial base, administrative capacity, educated population, and long history of statehood. Reconstruction occurred after total defeat and unconditional surrender, under long-term occupation by multiple powers. Even then it evoked authoritarian controls, censorship, and imposed political restructuring. More importantly, the same post-war order that rebuilt Western Europe simultaneously supported authoritarian regimes elsewhere. The lesson Western powers learned was not opposition to tyranny, but strategic management of it. If not, then when? This final objection frames rejection of regime change as moral paralysis. It is a false dilemma. Rejecting regime change does not mean endorsing genocide, aggression or tyranny. It means recognising that external military overthrow is not a legitimate or reliable mechanism for ending them. Defensive war, asylum sanctions, international criminal accountability and genuine diplomatic pressure are not the same as enforced leadership replacement. We'll talk about this in a later essay. The absence of a perfect response does not justify adopting the most destructive one. If regime change is justified only in retrospect, only when it succeeds, then it is not a moral principle at all. It is a victor's theology. The humanitarian pretext. In recent decades, regime change has been rebranded as humanitarian intervention. The language has shifted from conquest to protection, from empire to responsibility. The structure remains unchanged. Decisions are made by distant elites, enforced through violence and insulated from accountability when outcomes deteriorate. Civilian protection cannot be delivered by institutions whose primary function is organised coercion. Where interventions claim to save lives, they routinely prolong conflicts, radicalise factions, and entrench cycles of retaliation. The selective nature of humanitarian concern is itself revealing. Atrocities committed by allies are minimised or ignored. Those committed by adversaries become casus belli. This is not ethics, it's power translated into moral language. Why no exception holds. Regime change is unjustifiable not because it sometimes fails, but because it rests on a false premise that freedom can be imposed from outside and that violence can provide a foundation for legitimacy. Even when regimes are brutal or corrupt, their replacement by foreign force does not empower populations. It transfers power to occupying authorities, compliant elites or armed intermediaries. The result is dependency, resentment and instability. Political change is not rooted in local agency. Political change that is not rooted in local agency is not liberation. It is occupation by another name. Conclusion. Regime change is never justified because it denies the principles it claims to uphold: self-determination, accountability and collective responsibility. Whether framed through Cold War logic, humanitarian concern or nostalgic appeals to the Second World War, it remains an authoritarian practice masquerading as moral action. If freedom is to mean anything, it cannot arrive on the back of a foreign army.